All right. So, thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar today on how to successfully navigate permitting challenges for renewable projects. Before jumping in, we're just going to do a couple of intros here. So, I'll just start out. I'm excited to say that between the three of us, by the way, we have more than 50 years of renewable experience. Hard to imagine. I know, right? It's kind of crazy. Hard to imagine. I've been a consultant in the field for almost 20 years. I'm a VP at Atwell, and the majority of my experience has actually been focused on permitting renewable projects across the U.S. Throughout that time, I've worked with so many different clients. So you work with, larger clients, large IPPs, smaller developers, and utilities. And I imagine that we're going to hit the fact that a lot of these clients are, have their differences and how they like to, go throughout their projects. So the two experts that I have here, we're going to dive into it a little bit. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jason just for a quick intro.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tracey. I'm Jason Utton. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Atwell's Vice President of the Power Group, responsible for supporting all the work we do in the renewable energy market. That includes wind projects, solar projects, battery storage systems. I have 16 years of experience developing thousands of megawatts, most of which from my last job, where I was the Vice President responsible for NextEra Energy's Midwest Renewable Development Shop. And now at Atwell, I help clients navigate the ever-changing, renewable energy landscape. I've also spent a few years in Washington, D.C. as a NextEra lobbyist on Capitol Hill, working to get renewable tax credits extended. And as it relates today, I've been involved with all types of permitting since 2008. I've been on both sides of that, the good side of permitting where it worked and the bad side of permitting where it didn't work. So for those viewers that don't know, Atwell is a 100-year-old consulting firm that's been helping clients in renewable energy since 2008. We support every phase of renewable energy development from prospecting to early stage, advanced stage, and even construction. In addition to the power group, Atwell also has a real estate land development group and an oil and gas group. And we provide a whole host of consulting services to all three markets, everything from land, environmental, permitting, survey, engineering, and construction management. We work with utilities, IPPs, small development shops, foreign shops that are trying to develop a U.S. presence, and also kind of what I refer to as non-traditionals, oil and gas companies that are building up a renewable presence inside their own companies.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we've been talking about doing these webinars for a little bit now. And because of all this experience that we have as a company, we thought that, putting together some of these webinars to kind of share some of our experiences would be helpful to the industry. But David, do you want to?
Sure. First and foremost, I want to thank Tracey and Jason. I mean, the kick for me is being able to do a webinar with friends and to have a conversation about some of the things that we've been so passionate about and involved in over the course of the last couple of decades. And so, from that perspective, this is a lot of fun. And so my thanks to Atwell. Just in terms of the legalese, my views and the comments that I make today are my own. They're not related to Hawthorn or any of my previous employers. But to go a little bit further, and now that we've dismissed the legalese, I'm David Applebaum. I'm a senior counselor with the Hawthorn Group. I've been around a long time. I've done everything from politics to business development to government and regulatory affairs for the last 4 decades. And I've been around the energy industry for the last 25 years. Worked as a chief of staff and as a policy director to 2 members of Congress and to a governor. Was a business development director for a fuel cell manufacturer. Was vice president of government affairs for an IPP in New York. If any of you are old timers and you remember Scythe Energies, Scythe was a company that was back heavily involved in the IPP sector in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And then with Jason, I was in government and regulatory affairs for a major renewable developer for nearly 17 years before retiring and joining Hawthorn. Just a couple of words about Hawthorn. The Hawthorn Group is a government and public affairs firm out of Alexandria in Virginia. They've been in existence for approximately 3 decades. Much of their activity, even though they're located in DC, is really at the state and local level, which is where all of us really focus our attention and all of our activity and where frankly all of our concerns stem from, at least most of them. So Hawthorn specializes in strategic communications and research, issues management, crisis planning and response. And then for purposes of this discussion, the real focus is grassroots and grass tops and coalition building and community relations, things that keep us all up at night when it comes to our renewable projects. Hawthorn's worked in just about every sector and industry that you can think of: healthcare, education, higher education, telecom, gaming, soup to nuts, they've covered it. In the energy sector, they've probably worked with almost any major energy company in the regulated space that you would know, and more recently have been involved in the renewable energy sector as well, which is what I come out of and what they focus on. So for purposes of this discussion, I mean, we've represented a number of companies in the renewable space. We've based today's discussion on that experience. As Jason said, it's the good, it's the bad, all those things that we've encountered over time. Hopefully we can put it to good use and give you some tips and pointers on how to work through the permitting regime.
Great, thank you guys. So as we discussed, the purpose is to try to educate some of the viewers about permitting challenges in the U.S. And hopefully provide some helpful insights, maybe some nuggets. With the variety of folks that we have on the webinar, could be some seasoned experts along with some kind of newer developers or newer folks. So hopefully you get a little nugget here and there. So the topics that we're gonna try to cover is understanding the permitting landscape, identifying permitting challenges, and then discussing some of the strategies for successful permitting. And I just want to mention to everybody that we're going to have a Q&A section, hopefully time permitting. We do have a time clock, so we're going to try to stay on here. If you all have questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box down. I think it's on the bottom of the webinar page. So feel free to shoot them over as we're kind of going through. But why don't we just dive in here, guys? What do you think?
Sure.
All
Yeah.
right, awesome. So why don't we, Jason, can you maybe get us started? I know, so Jason really likes to read all of this stuff in his spare time and kind of get to know everything. So why don't you just get us started with an overview of the current state of renewable energy in the U.S.?
Sure. So, I mean, simply put, the state of the renewable energy industry from an economic perspective is the best I've ever seen. Most probably would agree it's the best environment ever to work in this field. If you think about it, we grew up in an industry that, because renewables weren't part of comprehensive tax reform in the 80s, that wrapped in all the other traditional types of energy. Think all the way back then, wind and solar wasn't really a thing in the 80s.
Right.
Because we weren't included in those permanent incentives, that was tax reform. The renewable industry has somewhat been held hostage to extenders packages that could or couldn't get extended every 2 years. And, that level of uncertainty kind of constantly persisted. And, even in that level of uncertainty, the industry found a way to be more competitive and to be more cost effective than just about every other form of energy out there. And last summer, that once every other year extension not only got extended out for decades through the IRA, but included a bunch of other provisions like standalone battery ITC or PTC, transferability for tax credits, not to mention the first ever batch of adders, think energy communities, that, when taken together, reduce LCOEs 40 to 60%, making renewables the outright economic leader. When I was in Washington, we always tried to impress upon lawmakers that certainty in any industry really drove down costs and improved efficiencies. Well, we definitely have that certainty now.
Right.
But, and unfortunately there always has to be a but, the most elusive piece of any new renewable project, believe it or not, isn't materials such as copper or steel. It isn't labor, and it isn't really even capital. It's the permits. And, Bloomberg had a pretty good article out yesterday that was entitled, without the right approvals, nothing gets built. And, that's true. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. And, that, and then you couple in, the polarization of the country has grown rapidly to levels I've never seen before. And just about anything you try to do in this country, particularly if you try to build something, you're going to upset half the people that, you're engaging with. And with the level of connectedness, throughout the country only continues to grow. And social media is a great way to stay connected with friends and family and loved ones, but it can also create a pretty toxic environment. And you can find out there that there's sometimes quite a bit of misinformation.
Right.
And trying to sort through all of that is a challenge. So the important thing is, as you're thinking about development, from an economic perspective, the state of the industry is great, but when it comes to permitting, you have to be really smart about doing the work on the front end so that you're not tripped up on the back end.
And so, David, maybe if you want to kind of dive into a little bit on the regulatory framework and, and some of the key stakeholders.
Sure. And I really want to pick up on a couple of the points that Jason made because I think they were really spot on. I mean, when you think about now the permitting regime, you as a developer or as a consultant to a developer, put yourself in the position of a decision maker, a member of town council, somebody on planning and zoning, whatever that would be, and the information flow that comes in that you have to base your decisions on. It's not going to be just the ordinance, it's going to be on the politics as well. And so think through that as you sort of put yourself in their mindset or in their frame. I know that there's a sense out there that the opposition is organized, it's institutionalized, it's become an industry, it's well-funded, there's dark money behind it. And, I think when we're talking about renewables, we should also put battery storage in the mix as well. Even though it's a different technology, all of us know that it gets lumped together, and particularly at the local level, very little is known about storage. So think about them collectively. And so what we've seen over time is that most opposition to renewables or storage is genuine. The concern that's in these communities is real. They pick up information from institutionalized websites. Why? Because that's all they know. That's all they have to go on. And you as a developer have the responsibility, and we'll talk about that today, to get out front of that before it becomes a problem for you. You have the opportunity and the responsibility to provide full information as much as you can as soon as you know what you have to provide and as soon as you understand the parameters of your projects. You need to put that out there before the opposition gets there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a critical aspect of all of this. Now let's think about this. Everything that we're going to talk about today is pretty intuitive. And so why are we doing this? You're master of the obvious. You know all these things. Why are we doing this? Because there's so much, as Jason said, whether it's IRA or RPSs in different states, there's so much opportunity and it's growing exponentially every day. And developers that used to do 5 projects now have 15.
Yeah.
There's so much on your collective plate that it becomes extremely difficult to make sure that you touch every step and cross every item off your list before you move on to the next one. We're here to help you avoid that. Most important when you think about the permitting regime, understand that there are multiple layers of permitting that you need to think about. There's federal, there's the RTOs if you're in competitive market spaces or restructured markets. There's county and local and state. All of those provide multiple touch points for opponents to come back and delay or deny your project. So as you step through that regulatory and permitting regime, understand that you need to make sure that you cover all your bases. We'll talk a bit later on about how to do that. But I think hopefully that helps set the table for the discussion.
Great. Jason, do you have anything else to add there?
No, I think David hit it perfectly. It's all about doing the work on the front end and understanding who you need to have on the team.
Right.
Is going to get you success.
Cool. So I guess let's kind of get to the, what we're discussing too, and talk about some of the common challenges, right? So we've talked about some of the stakeholders involved. Maybe we can start out there. David, you want to jump in there?
I mean, here's a great example. I was at a regulatory conference, or renewable conference in Charlotte. It was probably, sometime 6 months ago. Really terrific. They had a panel that was for renewable developers sitting up there discussing, among other things, what keeps you up at night? what are the 3 or 4 top items that really bother you and create most challenges for you as you think through your permitting regime and as you try and get your project approved? And sort of, I mean, I expected to hear inflation, supply chain issues. Absolutely, they're out there. Number one issue, community opposition. I wasn't quite expecting that, but it's really endemic of what's now happening. The more renewables that are out there, particularly if there's one in a community and now in another part of the county, there's 2 more coming up, everybody is better attuned and better informed, at least on the opponent side, about what these projects are. So, I mean, we talk about what to do and what not to do. Here's some things on the list of stuff not to do. And, you know, I think number one is don't play hide the project. Don't expect that you won't be found out. And here's an example. In a community that had not seen renewables before, there was an engineering company that was driving along, prospecting, looking for a developer. They were hired by a developer. There were out-of-state license plates on the vehicle. Somebody just saw this strange vehicle cruising around in the neighborhood, took a picture of the car and the license plate and did a check and figured out that this same entity, this same company, was involved in a nearby renewable project. It's now on Facebook.
Right.
And now you've got a problem. And now you're behind. So the second thing is don't assume that you've got decision maker support. Your decision makers, your mayor and council people, they may be terrific. You've had your meetings. They're very receptive to what's going on. They've given you all the right vibes, all the right signals. Perfect, perfect, perfect. But in the heat of the opposition, if there's now a public hearing and there's 100 people wearing red shirts in the audience, and your supporters are few, if they exist at all in that room, you're going to have a difficult time keeping your decision maker support. There are ways to deal with that, but it's just something to be aware of. Don't assume you've got that level of support. Sort of third on the list is don't cede the playing field. You've done everything right as a developer. You've got your land, you've got your point of interconnection, you've got your queue position, you've said hello to the mayor and council, everybody's very receptive, things look terrific, you've got great resource, solar, wind, whatever that might be, and now you say, okay, we're in great shape. Now you go back to headquarters and you spend the next 6 months working it through the vetting process, and you've checked off all your boxes, it's all green lights. 6 months later, you go back, and you've now found out that the community has figured out exactly who you are, and you're now facing the opposition on Facebook, Twitter, any amount of social media you can imagine. Don't cede the playing field. You need to be a presence at all times, whether it's yourself or locally with other folks that you bring on board or a public affairs firm. You need to know what's going on. Item number 4, sort of a corollary of the first 3, don't expect your landowners to stand up and support you. They're great people. They're supportive of you. They're wonderful and they're thrilled because they get your lease payment. All of that's terrific. But again, they don't want to go against their neighbors in more times than not. It's public nature. It's natural. So as much as they're happy about your arrangement with them for a lease payment, if there's 100 people wearing red shirts and they're one of the few folks that supports the project, don't expect them to stand up and be your key supporters. And then the final thing, and it may be the most important, understand public sentiment, understand and incorporate sentiment analysis, stakeholder mapping into your process at the front end. Jason said this perfectly. You've got a plan for things, and in your plan has to be sentiment analysis and stakeholder analysis. We'll talk about that a little bit, but if that's missing from your origination process, you've missed a critical step. And somewhere a year, 2 years down the road, folks at management are going to ask you, why don't you understand or why didn't you understand the political risk? That's because you didn't do the stakeholder mapping and sentiment analysis up front. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, great. And, Jason, I know you probably have some stuff to add to that. And feel free to add that in. But one other thing that we really haven't hit on, which is huge, right, is transmission and grid connectivity. I mean, I think that could be a whole webinar in itself, but maybe you can touch upon some of that as well. And maybe if you have anything to add to what David was saying.
I mean, just really quick with kind of what David was at, and maybe two good points. And I think, David, you said this to me yesterday, day before, is don't forget that the decision makers, if they're elected officials, they're running for office.
Right.
And they are going to do what gets them reelected. So it's really incumbent upon you to give them the support they need to vote for something or be able to make sure they're prepared. And then the other thing is the landowners. This has tripped me up in the past, is that your landowners see the opposition at church, and they see him on the baseball field or in the bleachers. They see him at the grocery store. So again, you don't make sure again that you're doing the front end work, but you're arming your supporters with the information they need to dispel the myths or dispel the misinformation or things like that. And you're right, when it comes to transmission, it's almost like we could do a whole separate webinar on this because, I think it was earlier this year, I saw a really interesting title to an article that said, it kind of went something a little bit like this. The U.S. has billions of dollars for wind and solar. Good luck plugging it in.
Right.
Because, the state of the industry's never been better, kind of how I started off. But the challenge, and this was a challenge before the IRA became law, was the explosion of clean energy projects is completely overwhelming the system for connecting them to the grid. And, we've already seen an unprecedented growth in interconnection requests from about 2010 to today. And the U.S. interconnection queues all across the country have grown fivefold in the past decade. And the majority of the stuff that's in those queues are renewable projects. So at the end of last year, nationwide, there were roughly 8,100 energy projects that were asking to be connected to the grid. That's up from 5,600 at the end of 2020. And nationwide, again, if you take all of the interconnection queues and you add them together, it's about 2.04 terawatts of asks or new generation that wants to plug into the grid.
Crazy.
If you're curious, the U.S.'s existing capacity is only 1.25 terawatts.
Wow.
So there are more projects in the queue right now than energy that the U.S. could even consume. The largest growth, a lot of folks know this, but if you don't, the largest growth we've seen has been in MISO, where MISO's 2022 cycle was 171 gigawatts, again, mostly renewables. And again, if you're curious, MISO's summer peak is 123 gigawatts. So you have way more projects that are asking to be studied than will ever get built. And in fact, from about 2007 to last year, roughly 80% of the queue was never built. Projects get scrapped for a whole host of reasons. Your economics don't pencil. You don't find an off-taker. They fail to get their permits. But because you have so many more projects in the queue, what I refer to as like speculative projects, it just takes longer and longer to get studied. The bulk of renewable projects that are queued right now, it takes at least 2 years to get studied. In some, it takes over 4 years. Right. To mitigate this, the ISOs are doing a lot of work on tariff reform. PJM instituted a 2-year freeze on new interconnection applications in 2022, just simply to give staff time to process the backlog of applications. And last week, MISO gave a heads up that they were extending their 2023 Q cycle submission deadline until after they had made tariff improvements. They plan on providing an initial package of what those tariff changes look like at their July PAC meeting, Planning Advisory Committee meeting. But it's important to stay up to date on these reforms, making sure that you're including them in your development timeline and your development budget, because it's really important. And, you're right. Maybe it should be a completely separate webinar, but as you're thinking about permitting and permitting timeline and permit sunsets, you need to be thinking about your interconnection filing. So it's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, one additional thing, I've had a chance over the course of the last few months to follow the New York ISO, which is also going through queue reform. And what they're talking about doing is, and it's a little esoteric, but multiple clusters sort of staged more closely together so that they can move things along more quickly. And the ISO, I think, is responding to concerns in New York State that the state may be falling behind in meeting its renewable goals.
Right.
And that's one major impediment. But as you think about the trade-offs, and you were talking about these, folks want things to move faster in terms of reviews for their projects and get them online more quickly. But by the same token, the things that are necessary in order to shorten that time frame, such as the fees that are associated with getting into the queue or for the study, or anything associated with potential for getting your money back, or in the middle of the process, changing the configuration of your project for study purposes, they don't want that lack of flexibility. You can't have it every way.
Right.
In order to make things move more quickly, there have got to be some compromises along the way. All of the RTOs are really struggling with that right now. They'll get there because the goals drive them to do it, but it's a real challenge. And Jason hit on that.
So why don't we? Can you guys address some concerns, related to public opposition, like local zoning restrictions and community engagement? Maybe like a what not to do type of scenario.
Sure.
Yeah, I know, right?
Well,
If you had your magic 8-ball, your crystal ball.
Well, maybe the better thing to do in terms of having, talking about what not to do, maybe what we should do is can we talk about what to do?
Sure.
I mean, let's go there and see it, because we talked about things to avoid doing, how to deal with that. But there are really some fundamentals that you should talk about if you're really getting into the process of how do we do this the right way? And the first and foremost step, particularly because IRA has created so much opportunity, is for every developer to think about how they mentor their developers. There are so many new developers coming in. There's so much churn in the industry. There's so much new opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, developers that had 5 projects on their plate now have 15. And so what are they going to do? They all want to deliver to management. They all want to get their projects over the finish line. But in a situation like that, you end up probably skimming corners a little bit, doing shortcuts, stuff like that. So mentor your developers. Have senior developers work with junior developers. Have a third party come in and do some training. There are certainly ways to do that. We do that. Others do that. Have a playbook that sets out the things that you must do, shall do, may do, whatever, and give them sort of a guidebook that helps walk them through the process of getting a project done. The permit 1, 2, 3, or how do you get that done?
Their toolbox.
Their toolbox.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And by the way, the opponents have a toolkit too
Yeah. Right.
of things that they need to say to push back on projects. Here's what you should do to get your project across the finish line. The 1, 2, 3, all the way through the process. And then there needs to be somebody within a company that makes sure that those developers adhere to it. Because the worst thing is to have a guide and nobody follows it.
Right.
So the second piece of that is, we talked about this a little bit on the what not to do, is you need to really understand local sentiment before you decide whether or not to develop a project. Know what's going on in that community. How do you do that? You can do a deep dive research project. We do those. Others do those. But it's a soup to nuts stakeholder mapping, sentiment analysis, and it also helps you craft your message. But what should you be doing? Deep diving on not only who the decision makers and influencers are, but what's the development profile in that community? Is it mostly agrarian? How have they dealt with Home Depot or Starbucks or other development projects that may or may not be renewable related coming into that community? If they're opposed to things like that, they're probably not going to be thrilled about renewables. Just something to think about. Likewise, budgeting. What's the local budget look like? What's the school budget look like? Have they voted down school bond, issues that are on the ballot? That'll give you a sense for whether or not they really have a need in the community
Right.
for more income that a renewable facility may be able to spin off. What about first responders? What about EMTs? Is there enough of that? Is there a stress on police and fire in the community that, again, a local project may be able to help fill the financial gap associated with that? So soup to nuts, you need to understand that and understand it up front. From a messaging perspective, you've got a couple options. One of them, if the community is large enough, you do a poll. But there are polls and there are polls. You can do a happy poll, which we're not really thrilled about. Happy polls are the ones where somebody goes out into the field and says, do you support renewables? Do you support solar and wind? That kind of thing. Anybody can do those. And by the way, even in the most opposing community, chances are you're going to get
yes.
60 or 75%. I mean, you'll get some really wonderful number. And then when you dig deeper into it,
Right.
which you should do, you'll find out that it's not all, love, luck, and lollipops. It just doesn't work that way. And so what you should also do is do a messaging poll with it. One that tests messages that work best for you, those that work best against you, that the opponents will use. And you'll find in many instances that not everybody out there favors climate change. But instead, what they might favor is keeping farms in farmers' hands, allowing landowners to use the property as they choose, energy independence, American energy independence. That resonates very well, whereas climate change can be construed as being something, a little bit more liberal or things of that nature. Gets politically branded.
Political, right.
Understand what the messaging is and what the messaging should be before you go in and actually hit a community. Create a narrative that works best for that community based on that research that you've done. Sort of in my category of understanding local sentiment, number 2, find local champions. There are people in that community who know everybody. You're from Florida, and maybe you want to go develop a project in Iowa. You're not necessarily familiar with everything that goes on in Iowa. Find somebody in town who supports your project, who's willing to tell you who the key movers and shakers are, what are the key issues, and they could be both your eyes and ears, and in many cases, they can be your mouthpiece. But look for those local champions and make sure they're on the ground and you've got them up front in the process. Media tools, you know what they are. You have a variety of them at your disposal. You need to use them. In some communities, old school works best. What's old school? Direct mail, push calls, letter to the editor, door hangers, newspaper ads. I mean, that's traditional media as we all know it. And then, some of the newer tools, social and digital media, Facebook, Twitter, things of that nature. Put up a Facebook page, put up a project website, can be interactive, digital ads, customer management programs, things like that. I mean, all of that you should be able to integrate into your program just based on what the community needs are. But make sure you avail yourselves of those opportunities. Again, doing it up front is less expensive than having to do it at the back end when you have to rescue a project. Sort of the last couple of items pretty quickly, you do not have to win the noise battle. And in many cases, you won't in a community. There are going to be a lot of folks who are very motivated, who are very opposed to a project. What you need to do is have some supporters, demonstrate that to decision makers and influencers, and then be able to give the right information to those decision makers. Because I think ultimately, Jason, you said this earlier, folks want to make the right decision, but yet they are public officials. And they're going to react to what they know and what they hear. If you've given them the right information, it's going to work fine for you. And chances are, even with significant opposition, you can win the day. And then last piece of this, and we were talking about this the other day, once you've gone COD, your project's up and running, do not leave. You need to be in that community and you need to stay there. The landscape is littered with companies that have made the mistake of building a project and going home. Not being a neighbor in the community, not investing in the community. And I know there are folks out there, developers out there saying, geez, we don't have the G&A for that. We don't have the budget for that, things of that nature. We're not talking about big ticket items. We're talking about stuff that's, $250 for, to help with uniforms for the Little League, paying for memberships in the Civic Association, helping out with an ad book for a local civic association, the Lions Club, Kiwanis, the Garden Club, whatever that might be. It's a very small investment with very big return. But if you leave, they'll find you. And my parting words are, I've seen this happen in a project in a middle Atlantic state, which I won't name, where there was a wind project that was up and running, had been in the community. There was nobody there who anybody knew how to reach. And so a member of the county committee, who was an EMT, was looking for at least a little bit of seed funding to help get a new ambulance so that they could take patients 25 miles away to the nearest healthcare facility. And she said, I just can't find these people. So she reached out to the local senator, who was more than happy to put in a piece of legislation to tax wind.
Wow.
And perennially,
Wow.
that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every single year, same senator, same bill, and it forces all of the renewable developers, not just the one, to come in and spend a boatload of money on trying to beat back legislation, which really didn't have to take place, didn't have to exist in the first place. Do things at the front end, but make sure you take care of the back end.
I think that's interesting because if you look at a lot of our, larger IPPs, they have, you have your handoff of the project
Exactly.
once it goes into operations. So sometimes that kind of, messaging gets lost in the mail, I bet, with some of the folks.
Yep.
So that's pretty
And then
important.
some IPPs, I won't mention names, but I have one out there that I'm thinking of that's actually really sharp about it.
Yeah.
And they actually build it in their business management budget. The
Mm,
business management team will continue to contribute. And they will sometimes
Right.
contractually sign up for that so that they know that, because in a lot of places, if you find that one project's successful, you may want to do an expansion.
Yeah,
Phase
exactly.
2, phase 3. I've been parts of 3 and 4.
Right.
So again, I think it's really important that you don't leave, because part of the messaging that developers always say is we're long-term partners of this community. We're going
Mhm.
to be here for many, many years, decades. And you have to actions, not just words.
Mhm.
I don't know of any company out there that doesn't say, we always want to be a good neighbor. We're in it for the long haul. We want to be in your community and really contribute. We want to be there. And some do it and some don't.
Right.
And, that's just something to think about.
So, Jason, maybe you can, kind of dive into some of the comprehensive project site assessments and kind of, a little bit, more detailed there, some of the stuff that you might do.
Yeah, I think maybe taking a lot of kind of what David said and so, kind of what do you do? And I think the differentiating factor between experienced, successful developers and inexperienced or unsuccessful developers, and I've mentioned this before, is spending the time and the money up front early in the process to find the right sites, considering, all the things that David touched on. Obviously, you got to have a good resource. You have to have the available interconnection, large parcels of land, but doing that initial community engagement assessment to find the project's unique permitting requirements or challenges well in advance of land acquisition. A lot of
Right.
people say, we need to get into the queue. The queue has a land requirement or a site control requirement. Just go get land, and haven't done anything on the front end from a community engagement piece. So, if you're out there and you're joining us today on the webinar and you've heard, David talk about his list of to-dos, and, you may have heard some of this for the first time, kind of the high level overview of kind of what we're talking about is that, instead of doing just a CIA, Atwell does a lot of CIAs. We're very good at it. Critical issues analysis, where you find out the very specific type of permits you need. Local, is it township or is it county? And do they have an ordinance? And, what's the rule set you need to follow to get your permit? You need to do a comprehensive permitting strategy that considers a lot of other things, a lot of the things we've been talking about today. And I think that's kind of some of the reason why we're doing this. Both of our companies can help if you're looking for help. Inexperienced developers, let's say, they'll find out that they need a certain CUP, a conditional use permit. Check the box, move on. No, what you need to do is you need to take it much deeper and figure out what those subsets are. You mentioned, how do we specifically engage with the local community? How do we find out who the key decision makers are? What's the overall sentiment? Maybe it's a poll. What's the overall sentiment for renewables? Also, what's the history in the area? Was there an irresponsible developer that came before us we don't even know anything about? All the land agreements have terminated. It looks like a very clean area, but we're walking into basically a buzzsaw and we don't even know about it. That's really, really important, because you can be guaranteed that there will be opposition out there. And quite frankly, in my opinion, I think it's kind of really hard to find areas in this country now where there's no opposition. When I first started and I was in the plains of North Dakota and South Dakota, that was an amazing place to do permitting because people were candid. They had very frank conversations with you. There wasn't a lot of toxicity. People were open to having a frank discussion. But as I mentioned kind of in the very beginning with the state of social media and just the polarization, it's become toxic in certain areas. You need to really understand that. And, while you're getting all your land and doing the environmental field work, working on the PPA, you should not be waiting to engage these local stakeholders. I've made that mistake before. I knew what I needed to get from a conditional use permit, and I immediately started on the land and thought, once I have enough land, it becomes a real project. Then I'll go back and see what the permitting environment looks like. That's a way that you can basically fall into a trap, because if you do all of that work before you find out what the permitting or community engagement landscape looks like, you could have lost before you even started. And, it takes a long time to build up the responses. If you haven't been there, and to your point, they took a picture of a truck and they're throwing opposition at the decision makers, and we haven't been there, you're going to roll in and 6 months of opposition is in front of you that you have to start to beat back. So it can be a challenge. So, lay out a strategy. Again, both Atwell and Hawthorn can help. Who are you going to engage? How are you going to engage them? When are you going to engage them? And I think you hit on this, have a media plan, because sitting in on a public county commissioner meeting or talking to a planning and zoning administrator is not enough anymore. You need to come up on social. You need to have a website, farm radio. I love farm radio. You mentioned the old traditional ways, editorials you mentioned. Each site is going to be very unique to what is needed for that particular area. And it's based on all of that intel that you do in the front end. Before I entered the industry, I was a military officer for 10 years. I had a very smart 2-star general tell me this right on the heels of Iraq. He said, situational awareness leads to situational dominance. And if you don't understand the situation you're walking into, there's no way you can dominate the landscape. So you have to do the front end homework to make sure you're successful.
Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing is, as we, the industry is getting more busy, we're looking for people. There's more, there's newer people coming into the field, right? So they're going to need these tools and, to kind of help them because as we were saying, not only are some of the experienced developers and, folks going from 5 to 15, but there's a lot of new folks entering the field.
And you
right?
mentioned in the very beginning, maybe everyone will get one nugget, 1 or 2 or 3 nuggets out of this webinar. If you're a senior experienced developer, you may have a smirk on your face. I probably would if I was watching the webinar. Your nugget is, David's number 1, mentor the new developers,
right.
because you have a ton of experience and you've seen a whole bunch of things. Make sure they understand that,
Right.
because if they don't, they're unprepared.
Right. So I think we're going to move into Q&A. We have some questions rolling in if you guys are
Okay,
open to
sure.
that. I know I can't believe 45 minutes have already gone by. That's just crazy. How did that even happen? But here we are. So the question is, as oil and gas companies create spinoffs into the renewable sector, I think one of you mentioned that, are they experiencing the same sort of organized opposition that those that have been actively developing in renewables for many years?
You want to go?
So,
I can start, or you want to start?
I think if you're developing renewables, it doesn't matter if you're a spin-off or a sort of an associate or affiliate of a gas and oil company. There are plenty of them out there. We know who they are. You know who they are. They run into the same problems anybody else does. And so it's not unique to the pure renewable players in the field. It may be a little bit different if that company is well known in that particular community. But, for folks out there who don't necessarily understand renewables and don't understand that projects tend to be sited and buffered in a way so that it's very unobtrusive and can be. And granted, to Jason's point, there are plenty of developers out there who do things the wrong way. And so therefore that leaves a bad taste in the community. But I think as a general matter, they're all, whether they're with gas and oil companies or whether they're just pure renewable companies, they're all doing the same things when it comes to renewable development. And so they're going to get treated the same way.
Yeah, I think the oil and gas industry may have an advantage because there was probably opposition to some of their linear work they were trying to do. So they may understand the playbook when it comes to we want to lay a long pipe, or we've got this type of pumping station, this compressor station, or whatever, whether they're a major or midstream, wherever they are in the stack, they'll have probably been used to opposition, but this opposition is different. It's probably just as sophisticated as maybe opposition to oil and gas projects. So maybe they come at it from they're not surprised that there's opposition, but it's very specific. You know, if you're trying to develop a battery storage facility somewhere, don't think that, oh, well, it's not wind turbines. So with wind turbines, probably one of the biggest opposing things is the view shed, that just the fact that you have a 480 or a 500-foot structure with the flashing red lights on top. And if you can overcome that, well, then you've solved it. The big thing I learned when I transitioned from wind development to wind and solar development, I thought, well, surely it's going to be very easy because I no longer have these towers and I no longer have blinking lights. And then all of a sudden you learn about PFAS and you learn about panels that are getting sourced out of Southeast Asia. And it has a whole host of issues with batteries. Again, there's I think you mentioned this when we were talking a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of unknown out there in the communities because batteries kind of the newer renewable energy technology out there. So a lot of folks aren't used to it. They may not even have it in their master plans. So educating them is really, really important. And then dispelling with a lot of the myths and kind of the misinformation is also really important.
I thought that the farming thing was kind of interesting, that when that started to kind of come up, that, you think that these folks in ag land would be, would welcome renewables and solar, but we're taking away their business, and so that was kind of an interesting one to me, that, just kind of came up over the last few years too, is, you don't really think about that all the time.
But, and that could be maybe you have another one too, of needing to sort through the noise.
Yeah.
Because a farmer that signed with us will tell you that, let's say you're doing wind and your turbine takes up about 1 acre of farmland. The amount of money that farmer is going to make on that 1 acre, there's no way that they could get a yield high enough to get soy or corn or anything else. And you have to be careful because frequently what you'll hear the non-farmers that are saying that we're concerned with taking away of our farmland. But in a lot of cases where you have a smart decommissioning plan and a smart reclamation plan, those areas can be returned to farming soil or farming whatever crop you have out there. But it's interesting because the opposition will very rarely say we're opposed to renewables. It's your whole point. They will say we're opposed to you taking crop out of production or farmland out of production. We're opposed to the noise or the infrasound or all the different things, shadow flicker.
By the way, the thing that really is starting to become more and more of a prominent discussion is from not so much the farmers, because the farmers are interested. They understand what their economics are better than anybody. And so they're looking for a way to balance out what they can get from renewables and keep that farm in the family in perpetuity. They want to pass it down to future generations. What they're getting is from community leaders and neighboring landowners the pushback that says, we're going to tell you what to do with your land.
Right.
We're going to tell you that we need to preserve our agrarian culture. And I don't say that in any derogatory way because it's a real issue. But the response is, really? You're going to tell me as a landowner who've been in this community for a bazillion years, generations, that I can't do this because somehow it challenges the agrarian culture that you adhere to so much? So, I mean, it is that sort of push and pull that we're seeing in many, many communities now. And it's becoming much more prominent as things go along. Just another challenge that folks have to deal with. But it's a little frustrating.
Yeah. So we probably have time. I mean, geez, we could have probably done a whole Q&A hour, for this matter, but as the questions are rolling in. But we do have probably time for one more, we'll see. So what's the best approach to educate local governments with respect, that was my Boston accent there, with respect to state exemptions to applying local regulations concerning solar projects? Insert Jeopardy music.
Yeah. Okay. This is a challenge. I'm not going to venture a guess or issue a bet, but my sense is that could come from somebody from New York, where the state has effectively said, we're going to take jurisdiction over these issues, over siting issues, and we're going to have a statewide siting board, and they have the ability to override local permit approvals and things of that nature. There are a couple ways to educate them. Certainly the developer can do it, and the developers do it, but it's not a fun message to convey. It's helpful, although not perfect, if the state is also, if the state's taking jurisdiction, for a state agency that has responsible for that to educate throughout that process of getting to the point where there is state jurisdiction and state sort of exemptions from local. It's helpful if the state gets out there and helps with that. That doesn't mean, by the way, this is a wonderful question. That doesn't mean that it's going to make it any easier or create any less resentment at the local level. But when these things are going through, you start to pick up, these are state mandates. These are effectively treated as state mandates. Early and often education and a balance with what the localities can do is very helpful. A lot of that doesn't happen in certain states, but having that balance and having that education early from a state agency combined with what a renewable developer or other developers can do, I think is important. Probably doesn't help you with your challenge, but I think you need that state approach, state education, and developer education in the process to help out. And frankly, if there are landowners in the community that are going to benefit from that, having them participate in that process as well would really be helpful. Again, goes back to the discussion we had. May not be perfect. You may have landowners who aren't necessarily willing to stand up for a situation like that, but yet you have to try.
And I think too that, if you go into a state where it's a state permitted and they basically, is usurp the right word? They've taken the jurisdiction from the locals. You're in a situation as a developer where you can figure out the things that you can give on and go talk to that local jurisdiction and work with them and figure out what their concerns are and see if you can't give on something that you may not even have to give on through the state process. Maybe there's a slight shift in the project. Maybe there's some adjustment you could do here or there. Find ways to show the locals that you're responsive to their concerns versus just saying, well, the state has jurisdiction and I don't really have to listen to you. I think that'll go a long way. And again, every site is different. We can help with that, but there may be some gives that don't cost you anything, don't impact the economics, but visually, it may do a lot for you. And again, I know that most folks out there are doing solar and battery storage. The easiest example I could think of, and I did this actually in a Midwest state many years ago, is I had alternate wind turbines. And the alternates worked just as good as the main turbines. But we had one landowner, one family, non-participating, that did not want one primary turbine close to their house, as close as it was to their house. And for us, it made no difference to fire an alternate turbine and then just cut that turbine. We need to make sure that the landowner that was originally going to host that primary turbine was taken care of. I think he had 3 or 4 other turbines, but I had to go and sit with that landowner and talk to him, explain it to him. But when it came time to the meeting, the public meeting, it looked really good on our behalf that we were able to cut a turbine, and especially to the decision makers.
Yeah.
They're like, "You're going to do that?" And I said, "Absolutely. We're going to basically turn on this alternate turbine and we're going to turn off that turbine." And we ended up getting our permit. So it's those little things that you can try to find that you can give on that may go a long way.
Yeah, and sometimes states will mandate, if they have that jurisdiction that supersedes local permitting approvals, they will have built into that law some sort of a community benefit. They will require some sort of ratepayer offset. We're starting to see that in certain states. Community, I mean, we've talked about this for some of the projects that we've all worked on together, particularly it's been the case in Canada and some other jurisdictions as well. Community vibrancy funds. You know, the state has the permitting authority, but you will work with the community to customize a community vibrancy program that helps them for some period of time. There's a payment in lieu of taxes, of course, that you typically have to do. You know, obviously it's got to be worthwhile for the local community. And it's a way for them to stabilize their tax base in, you know, a 20-year period or some reasonable period of time. So there are things that you can do, but as Jason said, you need to work it closely and carefully and understand what the needs of the community are.
Great. Well, hate to cut this short, but we're going to have to wrap it up here, guys. I know that I know, right? It's crazy. Been some great discussion. So we only have a couple of minutes left. So maybe if you want to just kind of summarize some of the key takeaways, really high level, David. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay.
Jason loves this because I'm always like this on our calls.
It's pretty easy, and we'll keep it high level. It's not my forte, but we'll try. I think Jason said this very well. Begin that process, that planning process for your communities, for wherever you want to site a project as early as you can. Have a plan, execute to the plan, understand your opponents, and don't allow your opponents to set the table and to set the message before you do. Your plan should include all the steps that we talked about today, all the tools that we've referenced. And, you know, look, if you're in a pinch or if you want to plan or you need help planning, call Atwell, call us. We're happy to help. There are plenty of other companies in the space that we're happy to make references to.
You can call us.
Yes, that's right. I will call you. We know that everybody's got G&A concerns out there. They've got budget concerns. I can assure you, because we've talked about this before, doing things right at the front end is exponentially cheaper than doing things at the back end when you have a problem.
Great. Well, thank you so much, guys. I know we are, kind of at our time here. I do just want to let everybody know, well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining the webinar. We're also going to be live broadcasting this on our website, on the Atwell website, so you can share with your friends if they happen to have missed it. And we'll be following up with an email as well with our contact information, I think, so that, if you ever needed to reach out to any of us, we're here to help you. That's kind of, what we do. So any final words, Jason?
Good luck. I mean, there's a ton of opportunity out there for all of us. Just making sure that you find the right people to put on the team. And if there's a problem, don't hide it. Don't try to cover it up. Just reach out to the right resources. And you'd be surprised at all the things that have a solution. But yeah, it's been really good. And thank you for being available today. This was great.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.